My name is Jill Remick. I'm the Director of Property Valuation and Review at the Department of Taxes. Today is October 8th, 2024, and we are here to share some information with you folks as part of Act 68 of 2023. So just for a little bit of background, Act 68 of 2023 is a pretty major piece of legislation that came out of the Vermont legislature, addressing the needs for reappraisal structural changes here in Vermont, specifically to try to find a way to facilitate more frequent reappraisals. There are also other aspects of valuation in Vermont that the legislature asked us to look at, such as unconscious bias, grand list categories and categories of uses of properties. So there's a lot of aspects of that act, and I'm happy to try to explain some of those at some point down the road. But today's focus is really on the section of the report that deals with transitioning Vermont to a modern reappraisal system and structure. So as part of Act 68 in 2023, the Vermont legislature did appropriate some funding for us to actually go out and hire a professional consultant to help us do a lot of stakeholder outreach and research on how reappraisals are conducted in other parts of the country, a lot of feedback from Vermont stakeholders on how things are going, what's working, what's not working, and any suggestions for changes. So today we are going to be hearing from Justin Eimers from the IAAO Professional Consulting Services. He's going to walk through what they have found so far in their surveys and outreach, and then we're happy to answer any questions that you might have. So I think in light of the fact we've got about 50 people on the call, then we are going to have everyone muted, and we will ask you to put any questions you have in the chat. We may not be able to really do that much as we go through the slides, although if I see a question that looks like it's a clarification on a specific slide, I'll certainly call that out. And then at the end, we can go through and answer any questions. I'll put these instructions in the chat as well. But I will go ahead and say, let's see, Justin, are you able to unmute and
yes,
start? Great. All right, thanks. I'll kick it off to you while I keep admitting folks. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate everyone joining us today. As Jill said, my name is Justin Eimers. I'm an assessment advisor with IAAO, and I'm able to help you all out with this project. A little bit about my background. I've been in the assessment industry for about 19 years. And so I've worked in data collection, measuring houses, doing data analysis, valuation, defending values, sort of the whole process. Been in charge of an assessment office in the past. So just to get started, this presentation is really covering the survey responses and then what IAAO standards are. So I'm not going to be covering any of my recommendations. This is just so you all kind of have some background information on the information we're actually looking at to make decisions or to make recommendations rather. So and hopefully everyone can see my screen. Jill, you can see my
We can see your
slides, right?
screen. We can't see you, but we can see your presentation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So Professional Consulting Services, we're a wholly owned subsidiary of IAAO, and we do consulting projects like this for assessment jurisdictions around the world. So we had three major data sources when it came to this project. So we were looking at stakeholder responses, which you all should have received a survey. A lot of you filled that out. We got that information. We're able to analyze it. Also, we sent out surveys to all 50 states and Washington, D.C. to get an idea of what they're actually doing in their jurisdictions. And then we also looked at IAAO standards for best practices on how to handle certain situations. So the first questions we asked revolved around reappraisal cycles. So this is, revaluing, reappraising property and how often it should be reappraised. So we asked, stakeholders from Vermont, what reappraisal frequency would you recommend the state of Vermont adopt? And these were the answers we received. See, the most came in at around the 5-year period. So we asked a similar question to other states. We said, how often are properties reappraised in your state? So you can see that around 38% of the 29 states that responded to our survey said that they reappraise every single year. We had 4 states, or 13.8 roughly, that said every 2 years. So if you take the annual and the 2-year, you've got just over 50% are doing revaluations at least every other year.
And Justin, this is a good time, especially for this group who does this work a lot. We have asked in the report for definitions of what an annual reappraisal cycle, like what does that mean, right? Because I think a lot of folks on this call who are doing reappraisals, once every several years, might want to understand like how that's possible to do annual reappraisals, especially in a state the size of like Florida or Massachusetts. So would you mind explaining what the differences are? Thank you.
Yeah. So these states that do annual reappraisals, I know in states such as Florida, Texas, Kansas, and a lot of the other ones, they will do a full reappraisal. So they keep their data all up to date. They don't do re-inspections every single year. A lot of them, and we'll get into that a little later, they might do re-inspections every 3rd year, every 4th, 5th, 6th year, but they will reappraise every year. So they will look at whatever data they have, new sales, new income and expense data, new sales for depreciation or sales comparison approach. They'll look at that new data, create new valuation models, and then go ahead and value property on those new valuation models. And then, they go through the appeals process every year, from a lower level appeal on up. And so they do that every year, and they're keeping up on their permits or keeping up on their sales pretty much constantly. So that way they've got up-to-date data that they're making those valuations with. Now, there are some states like Massachusetts, I know they do annuals, but they will do statisticals on those off years. And so they're not doing a full reappraisal every single year. And so anyway, that's what kind of the annual could look like. And then some other states then go to every 2 years and that kind of thing. So.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, some might wonder, okay, well, what are the IAAO standards and on this? And IAAO has 15 standards on various topics related to mass appraisal and assessment. And so one of those standards is the standard on tax policy. And so if you looked at IAAO's standard on tax policy from 2020, 5.1, it recommends current market value. And it defines later in there, it says current market value implies annual assessments of all property. And that really comes down to the equity component, just because different parts of the state, different parts of jurisdictions, high value, low value properties all change at different rates as the market for those different properties is different. And so those annual reassessments are really the most equitable way to treat properties and property owners. So reinspection cycle. So I know in Vermont, reinspection cycle or data collection, that's been something that's been typically tied to the valuation cycle. In a lot of these states where they do valuations more often, the reinspection cycle is actually separate from the revaluation cycle, and the reinspection cycle are different things. So They will reinspect every 3, 4, 5, 6 years, and then but they might revalue every year, every other year, something like that. So we asked other states, how often does your state require reinspections? Other states, we've got, Washington, D.C., not a state, but anyway, a data point anyway, every 3 years, Maryland every 3 years. Um, you can see that most of, in saying most of, about 60% of the states that responded re-inspect every 6 years or more often. You can see that there. And we've got about 40% here in that 10 years to not mandating at all. 32% don't mandate a reinspection cycle. Of course, that doesn't mean that they don't reinspect. It just means that they don't have a mandatory statutory cycle. So IAAO standard on this, and I think a lot of you know just from some education pieces that have come around from PBR and folks around the state, but IAAO standard is every 4 to 6 years.
And Justin, there's a question, which I think is a good one to clarify. Do the states that do the annual reappraisal have zoning, and update like zoning permits, in each county?
Yeah,
Generally?
so every state I'm aware of, I don't know of any state where zoning is like required statewide. There might be states that do require it, but I know a lot of states have that issue of, this this city requires zoning, this one doesn't. And so I think it's pretty common to allow and not allow zoning. And that's where zoning or permits in some cases and some municipalities will require permits for maybe new construction, but maybe they don't require it for a new patio or a new deck or something like that. But it can vary, I guess, is the answer. And I'm not sure that Vermont's unique in that way.
Great, thank you.
Criterion mechanisms for off-cycle reappraisals. So we asked Vermont stakeholders, what mechanism would you recommend indicating the need for an off-cycle reappraisal, if any? These were some answers, probably no big surprises here, but CLA, COD, sales ratio. We had some folks that said none. IAAO standards, and looking at price-related differential, or PRD. So then we asked a similar question to other states. Do you have criteria and mechanisms for off-cycle reappraisals? And so you can see, roughly half the states do, half the states don't. I think you'll find that, if you're on an annual reappraisal cycle, there's not really a reason to do an off-cycle reappraisal because you're already doing appraisals every single year. And even if you're doing them every other year, an off-cycle is going to be hard to probably squeeze in there if you've got certain staffing levels and that kind of thing, if you're trying to double your workload right away. And so, something to think about when you're looking at these numbers. But yeah, about half do, half don't. So other states, let's see, if yes, what are those criterion mechanisms? So we're just asking them, what mechanisms these other states are using. So a change in the property, that might be a new construction, an addition, a demolition, something like that, which makes sense. Equalization, and some states allow, optional equalization. Say a jurisdiction sees that the market's going up really fast, they can opt to equalize or reappraise. And then other states have mandated equalization where, you fall out of a certain standard, they're going to require that you reappraise. Some states have they require reappraisal at the sale of a property. IAAO wouldn't recommend that. And that's kind of that California model where they only reappraise it if it sells, and not a real equitable model when you might have a property that's sold for 500 and right next to it's a home that's the same and it's valued at 200 or something like that. So okay, so IAAO does have sales ratio standards. And so these standards look at what's an acceptable range for values and what's not. And so those could be triggers for off-cycle reappraisals. So looking at the median sales ratio between 90% and 110% of market value is one of those, looking at that appraisal level. And then we've got coefficient of dispersion. And depending on the property type, whether it's single family home or, as anyone that has done a lot of land valuation knows, land can be a little tougher to value sometimes. And so that standard's a little wider, where it's 5 to 25 COD versus that 5 to 10 on a single family. Then we've got price related differential and price related bias, and that has to do with vertical equity. So we've heard terms about progressivity, regressivity, making sure that low value properties aren't overvalued in relationship to high value properties would be regressive, and then the opposite of that would be progressivity, where high value properties are valued at a higher ratio than maybe low value properties.
Justin, can you explain the difference between a differential and a bias in this context?
Yeah,
Like, what do those two things tell you? Thank you.
Price related differential it's a pretty standard ratio where you're looking at regressivity. It is susceptible to outliers, though. The price related bias is less susceptible to outliers, and so it's a newer way of looking at it, really. And so talking with IAAO's Research and Standards Committee, they feel like the PRB is really sort of the future of looking at vertical equity, and really a more accurate way of doing it, because it does cut out some of those outliers that can kind of really skew the PRD. But anyway, a little bit about those.
Thanks.
All right, so use of statistical reappraisal in the property valuation process. So, we asked Vermont stakeholders, what are your thoughts on statistical reappraisal? So reading through all those responses, about 75% were in favor of statistical reappraisal, about 25% not in favor of it. And then we asked another question, if statistical reappraisal continues to be used in Vermont moving forward, do you have any suggestions for improvements to the process or suggestions for a new process? And so here's a summary of potential shortfalls or issues with statistical reappraisals. And I think these are pretty obvious to some of us, but just to kind of go over some of them, without accurate data, statistical reappraisal would be unsuccessful. And obviously everyone knows that if your data is not clean, you're not going to have good values to start with. And so if you're, factoring those or adjusting those, it's still going to be off. So they should not be used too many times in a row. Full reappraisal would be the preferred method. Statistical, if you do have issues, you're just sort of multiplying those issues. So, yeah, definitely. And that's in line with IAAO standards. You don't want to use a statistical too many times in a row. And it could be used alternating with a full reappraisal, and that would be within IAAO standards. You could do a full reappraisal, say year 1, a statistical year 2, a full year 3, or you could do maybe a full year 1, a statistical year 3, and a full year at year 6, or something like that. And there's different options Vermont could look at as far as implementing statisticals or using statistical reappraisals. Statistical reappraisals should only be allowed if CODs are low. High CODs indicate the need for a full reappraisal. Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. So, all right. So we asked this of other states. Does your state complete any statistical reappraisals? And it looks like a little less than half said yes. 53% said no. And there again, if you're already doing well in the annual, you could do statistical and be on an annual cycle, or you could be doing full and be on an annual cycle, or a combination of the two. So looking at IAAO's standard on mass appraisal of real property, like I said, it does state down here below, I've got it underlined, values can be statistically adjusted between full reappraisals or model recalibrations to ensure compliance. All right, on to appeal structure. What would be the most efficient or effective, efficient, and appropriate political subdivision level for conducting property tax appeals? Please consider relevant population for an efficient and effective appeal process. So we're talking about, are you looking at the town level, school district, county, state level? What level would be the best? And the majority of respondents believe that the initial appeals should happen at the local level, which makes a lot of sense. Accessibility, that kind of thing. Some did suggest assessment districts, county, or school district for the first level of appeal. At what political or jurisdictional levels are appeals held in your state? So we asked this of other states, and you can see that 80% of the 25 states that responded either do it by the county or parish. Of course, Louisiana is the only one that does it by parish, but parishes are about the same size as the county. 4 states responded that they do it on the municipal level, and Montana responded that they do it at the state level. Now, Maryland is state assessed, but they do their appeals at the county level, their first level appeal. So, what does IAAO recommend? There isn't anything that specifically says it has to be at the county level, has to be at the municipal level, has to be at the state level. But it does say the informal level should be done by the assessor. So, I think they're thinking about whoever's doing that valuation or reappraisal, who's responsible for that value. Should be the initial level anyway. And it does talk about appeal boards must be knowledgeable, competent to hear appraisal related appeals. So, should Vermont have a single CAMA system? And this is one, anyway, we'll get into this. Would you be in favor of having a state computer assisted mass appraisal software system? Why or why not? And this was asked of Vermont stakeholders. So, should a statewide CAMA system be implemented? Roughly 70% of respondents said yes. Does every jurisdiction in the state use the same CAMA system? So we asked this of other states. So a single CAMA system, out of the 23 states that responded to this question, 5 said yes, 18 said no. Now, they did leave notes, though, next to their answers, or some of them did. And I didn't include Washington, D.C. because it's not a state, and they really just have one jurisdiction, so that one shouldn't really count. And then we've got Utah stated that by 2026 they'll be on a single system. Iowa and Michigan both said that 99% of their jurisdictions are on one system. So I'm guessing, maybe they've got one city that's not on the single system. And then South Dakota reported that they're going to a single system. So just some clarifying on some of these. So IAAO standard doesn't talk about that a state should go to a single system or shouldn't go to a single system. It does talk about the oversight agency should be equipped to provide CAMA system and all vital support functions to every primary assessor who cannot afford to purchase a system of its own. So physical reinspection versus alternative reinspection techniques. And I know this one is a sort of a hot button issue. So what alternative inspection techniques would you suggest be used or allowed? Some people said drone, satellite imagery, MLS, live remote video tours, surveys sent by mail, by email, Google imagery, industry standards. You can see these different ones here. LiDAR, AI tools, aerial imagery, drive-by. And then we asked other states, does your state require boots on the ground re-inspections, or does it allow for alternate re-inspection techniques? So these are the states that responded to the survey, and about half are requiring someone, actually is on the property, whereas about half are allowing for alternative reinspection techniques. Whatever those definitions might be, they're going to vary from state to state. So IAAO does have a standard that covers this, says jurisdictions may employ a set of digital imaging technology tools to supplement field inspections with computer-assisted office review. And something to supplement that in-person review. And then it does go on to say an on-site physical review is recommended when significant construction changes are detected, a property is sold, or an area is affected by catastrophic damage. So capacity building. So this is talking about staffing and that kind of thing. So Vermont stakeholder question, does the state of Vermont have the appropriate amount of assessment talent or staffing to complete current legal requirements of local jurisdictions? So, roughly 12% thought that Vermont does have adequate assessment talent, and 88% said no. What strategies or initiatives does your state offer to attract or retain skilled professionals to the assessment industry? And this is us asking this question of the other states. So competitive compensation, benefits, remote work, flex time, and then like a bonus system for anyone that has an assessment designation, whether it's a state designation or potentially maybe an IAAO designation, and then free courses, which I know Vermont has. Okay, so then kind of talking about some of those things to recruit people, we move into training, so evaluate training and career advancement opportunities for those in the assessment industry. So we asked Vermont stakeholders, do you have adequate training opportunities? 70% said yes, 30% said no. Please list improvements to training opportunities you would like to see implemented, if any. So here's a summary of suggestions. Education offered at high schools, trade schools, CCV, and other state colleges. have fall and spring training like before, more in-person education, more training for select boards and other non-lister, non-assessors, more training opportunities in general, alternate testing options for those with disabilities, more training for listers, more advanced level training, more state assessed standards, and then training to those standards. And then we've got Career Center Path to Becoming an Assessor, more data collection courses, mentorship programs. You can read the rest, but public education tool. So another follow-up question, do you feel there are adequate career advancement opportunities for those in the assessment industry? And this is a Vermont stakeholder question. So 84 said yes, 68 no, so 55% said yes, 45 no. What improvements could be made, if any? And this was asked of Vermont stakeholders. So create division of work, require a college degree, more opportunities for women and minorities, more awareness of the opportunities available, full-time positions with benefits, minimum wage for listers, larger assessment districts would allow for advancement opportunities, pay is too low, sharing assessors, standardized requirements, statutes that are up to date with modern times and allow for cutting edge techniques. Jurisdictions could do their own reappraisals, and assessing at the county level would increase opportunities for career advancement. So other states, we asked them, what training and career advancement opportunities does the state offer to jurisdictional assessment staff? So state paid education, travel for education, career ladder, and different assessor designation levels. We asked other states, what strategies or initiatives does your state offer to attract and retain skilled professionals to the assessment industry? Remote work, competitive pay, good benefits, work variety, flexible work schedules, annual raises, career fairs, annual bonuses for assessor designations, free classes. And there again, these are just suggestions that these other states had, not that it's not something that Vermont already does. So. All right. So IAAO standards. So IAAO has standards on professional development that make recommendations on the following topics. So there's a recommendation for education of assessment professionals, and there's actually a recommendation for entry-level staff and for people that are more mid-career, and then people that are further on in their career, or in charge of a lot of staff and that kind of thing. And so you can look to IAAO's standard on professional development for those recommendations. Some of the classes you're already taking are gonna meet that. There's some additional classes that are also in those recommendations. Administrative authority and responsibilities. There's standards on that, and then recommended courses. And I guess I just talked about that, but anyway. All right, so on to equity and anti-bias measures. So what anti-bias or equity improvement measures do you think could be added to Vermont's property tax system to help ensure equity for all? And this was a question we asked Vermont stakeholders. So appeals assistance for low-income property owners, avoid language such as rich, poor, trailer park, etc. Techniques to ensure rural areas are treated the same as urban areas, DEI, adequate education to value all property equitably, additional transparency, single canvas system statewide, appraisers that don't know that property owners would help. Require training and education, keep politics out of assessments, treat second homes the same as first homes, add PRD as a trigger for reassessments to guard against vertical inequity, and then no interior inspections. All right, so other states, we asked them, please list any equity or anti-bias measures used to ensure equal treatment of property owners in your state. So, and this is from a oversight agency perspective. And so, these are the things that they're thinking about is sales ratio, all this stuff we've talked about already, coefficient of dispersion, price related differential, price related bias, equalization study, checking for errors, adoption of IAAO standards on ratio studies. So, if you look at IAAO, and all the standards, pretty much all 15 standards point to more fair and equitable property values. Whether it's on professional development, making sure people are educated so they can make sure they're doing things properly and treating folks right. To standards on your how to value and how often to value and that kind of thing. All those standards point to more equitable values. And so conforming to IAAO standards and industry best practices helps ensure fair and equal treatment of all property taxpayers. And so I'd be happy to talk about some some different questions that people have got, or if anyone's got something they'd like to talk about. Or Jill, I don't know if you wanted to route this a certain way or not.
Yeah, there were a couple of questions in the chat that I think we got to. Definitely welcome other questions. I think one of the things I wanted to point out for folks too, while folks are thinking about they want to add some questions to the chat, the questions that Justin just ran through that were asked of stakeholders in both Vermont and other states were largely guided by the ask the legislature had of us for this report. There's certain things they wanted to make sure that we addressed in here. And also sort of broader context, the department is required to provide a pretty intensive report to the legislature this coming December in response to Act 68. And so this piece that Justin is running you folks through is one part of that report. So overall, the tax department is doing a large report about in response to Act 68 about the reappraisal, the 6-year reappraisal cycle that was put into Act 68 and sort of how to make that transition. And so this report and the sort of stakeholder feedback is helping inform that report and will be included as part of the report. And then there also will be other components. So it's been really helpful to have Justin and his team give us a lot of information about what's happening in other states and also some of the information that you folks shared. Hopefully all of you did participate in that survey that we sent out a few times earlier this, I guess it was the spring or summer. So yeah, if anybody has any questions that you want to put in the chat, then I can happily read them to Justin. Or statements for that matter. And Justin, I know some folks are interested in getting like a copy of the presentation. So I did record this, but I wonder if we can like make a PDF of it and I can put it up on our website and send it out.
Sure.
So we do have a question if other states require property owners to allow access for the physical property inspections.
Some states do, some states don't. As you can imagine, laws are different and different interpretations of their laws also. So, yeah. So, and clearly I think it's pretty common for a lot of states, even if there is a requirement, if someone asks them to leave, typically you do leave just to avoid confrontations and that kind of thing.
There's also a question if, or why can't updated Marshall and Swift cost tables be used annually?
It could be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that
I
was sort of
mean,
what they're getting at right now, that that's
yeah,
not how it currently works in Vermont. It's when they do a reappraisal.
yeah, those cost tables could be updated annually, and then depreciation could be analyzed annually and updated, to coincide with those new cost tables.
Great, thanks. Christine is asking about the possibility of the one camera system as being a possible recommendation. It's a possible recommendation. It probably won't be the only recommendation, right? So there are some things that we feel pretty clearly we can make a single recommendation, and in some cases, we might be sort of articulating some of the possible options. I think there's pros and cons to both. I think if we were starting the system from scratch, a statewide CAMA system for 300 and something parcels would make a lot of sense. And it does seem to be the case in a lot of smaller states. But we also want to be realistic about what would be, feasible for folks and how we can sort of set this up for success. So that'll certainly be discussed in the report. Another question was, how are other states funding their county and municipal assessment offices? Oh, that's a good question. Okay. Do you happen to have any insight on that?
Yeah, I mean, there of course there's always a little bit of a combination of both. I would say from my knowledge of budgeting and that kind of thing, a lot of them are funded at that local level. But you know, obviously the state could take on certain roles as far as taking on education like Vermont's done and taking on a lot of those expenses and or CAMA expenses or potentially GIS expenses, creating tools and worksheets and that kind of thing. I mean, the state's always going to be involved to a certain degree. It just depends on state to state.
Great, thanks. Right. Similarly, someone's asking about what the impact would be on the local town budgets. So the idea, one of the major recommendations that the legislature asked us to come back on, it's sort of outside of what Justin has presented, but for the overall report, are if there are any changes to the current like per parcel payment system that we have in place right now. And that we would, I mean, I would think we are going to need to get some state funding to implement any changes that we want to make. And as you folks have heard me say several times, the per parcel payments that go out now have not been updated for inflation since I think 2005. So they really aren't adequate. But on the other hand, there's a lot of reappraisal funds that have gone out to towns that haven't been spent on reappraisals because they haven't been able to find anyone. So how can we leverage that money and also change the per parcel payment structure to something else that might make more sense? So that is definitely part of the recommendation. And Christy Wright has her hand up, our field director. So if Christy, you can unmute, I think you can unmute yourself. I don't think I have to do that.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention when we talk about updating Marshall Swift costs on an annual basis, that it's much more than that. And I just wouldn't want it to be misconstrued that you would really need to study your market, and it's not as simple as that, especially if you want to keep your COD intact. So I think it's really important to point that out for folks.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, you need to look at land depreciation. You kind of have to relook at everything.
Thank you. There's also a statement about just wondering about the education requirements for the elected lister position. Yeah, I think, there are also requirements for clerks and treasurers, right? Especially like election oversight. So there are some existing requirements. I think the idea really, maybe the requirement word isn't really correct, but we got to do everything we can to make sure people have the tools and the training that they need to do the work effectively. I think Christy and her team do a really, really good job of being available and doing trainings for towns throughout the year. That, as you saw from Justin's presentation, that was one of the places that Vermont felt like we had a good set of resources from, and I would give Christy and her team a lot of credit for that. But yeah, the idea is not to sort of just put down requirements. The idea is to make sure that everyone has the training and the tools that they need to maintain their grand list. Someone's asking if this moves towards less local control. That's not a goal or a policy, obviously. The idea is actually just to make sure that we, again, get everybody what they need to do their work. A lot of local control in Vermont also is sort of leaving some towns to the wind where they can't find folks to do this work. They can't find a appraisal firm to do the work. And that's not really helpful either. That's just sort of leaving them to the wind. So anything we're recommending in this is try to help provide more resources and more tools to towns to be able to maintain their grand list. Do the majority of states have clawback measures in place when properties are improved without permits? That would be a question for you, Justin. I don't know.
I haven't seen a survey for that, so I'm not sure as far as most or how many do. I'm not sure.
Yeah, there might be fines or something like that. Let's see. Someone's saying clear definitions of statistical reappraisal versus a fresh property inventory is needed. Simply recalculating values annually using updated tables is a far cry from a fresh annual inventory or property. Let's see. Someone's asking do you think this process will have the state billing for education taxes and remove municipalities from the process? No, that's not part of this report or this recommendation. That's kind of a separate entity. This report is really focused on the reappraisal and grand list maintenance work that municipalities do and what, if any, tools the state can provide to support the 6-year reappraisal cycle. A couple years ago, the legislature did ask for a report about moving billing for education taxes to the state, and we kind of that report's still on the legislative page. I think we're kind of like, well, we're neutral, but there's not really a lot of appetite for that, and it would cost some money. So I think that kind of, and I haven't heard it brought up since, so that's definitely not part of this report. Let's see if there's anything else in here. Yeah, and I think as part of the report that Justin and his team are putting together, and then the larger report that we're doing at tax, definitions are a key point of that. So I appreciate someone sort of articulating that. Right, when I had that same reaction when I first saw annual reappraisal, like that would be so much work, but we really have had to sort of peel out reappraisal, reinspection, and grand list maintenance and things like that. So all of those definitions are pulled out so that we all are talking about the same thing. So the idea of all of this work is basically to recommend to the legislature in December the best way to move to this 6-year reappraisal cycle. I think right now it's supposed to be in place for 2027. Here at PVR, and I'm sure a lot of the folks on this call know, we are already seeing towns contracting out through 2029. So it's definitely something that's going to be multi-year transition from our current system where there are reappraisal orders and voluntary reappraisals to a 6-year cycle. It's going to take a long time to sort of get everybody onto that cycle. We also want to make sure that we're not inadvertently requiring towns that have done a reappraisal in the next several years to do one in less than 6 years, right? So there would be sort of a buy for that first round of the 6-year cycles for towns that have done a reappraisal between sort of now and when this would go into effect. And something I want to be really clear while I'm speaking, and then I see some more questions, is I've had a few towns say, well, we're not going to do anything because we're waiting for the state to roll out the 6-year cycle, which I understand, but we are still very much strongly encouraging towns to continue to contract for reappraisals. Those will be honored, and we want to continue to have as many reappraisals done as frequently as they can be when appropriate. We definitely don't want anybody's grand list to continue to get more and more stale, especially seeing the level of the CELAs and CODs that we've seen recently. So whatever transition plan comes into place for this 6-year cycle should not stop anybody from looking into having a reappraisal, because you are going to need to get into that 6-year cycle at some point. And if you get into it and you get your reappraisal done, then that'll be taken into account when there's a schedule set. So I've heard that a few different times, like last week at Town Fair, and I'm just definitely don't want any towns to just continue to let their grand lists languish if they are able to contract with someone, which is another problem. Yeah, another question is if any of the report includes conversations about grievance and tax appeals. There is definitely a requirement from the legislature that we address that. And that's sort of back to Justin's questions that they asked in the survey, right? So like in Vermont, right, we have it's at the lister or assessor, there's the BCA, then it can either go to a PVR hearing officer through my office or to Superior Court and then to Supreme Court either way. And so one of the things that we've had to do a fair amount of research on that our attorneys have been looking into is what are some of the other structures that other states or counties do Do they have a valuation board? Do they have regional valuation boards that hear those on behalf of multiple towns? And so whatever sort of direction things start to solidify in, it makes sense for the grievances and appeals to happen at whatever the first local level would be. Let's see. Has there been further consideration given to adjusting the groupings for towns? Right. So we did release a preliminary report last year as required by the legislature that kind of had a theoretical, here's what the groupings are that we would sort of see happening. It did take into account like school districts, real estate markets, age of grand list, CAMA vendors, just transportation and accessibility. There were a lot of sort of those things kind of overlaid. But one of the ways that it could theoretically go if towns wanted to group by, supervisory union or supervisory district, nothing's stopping folks from doing that now. But it hasn't been as easy to just sort of overlay the school districts. So my understanding is that our folks did kind of take a look at that, but it was kind of hard to make that work, because the idea is also if you're sort of reappraising at the same time with your neighbors, it'd be great to also have the same CAMA system or same contract assessor or something like that, right? Are there other ways that those towns can work together? So at this point, those groupings are not solidified. They're suggestions in the last report. And they're just sort of giving a flavor of here's how realistically we could break up the town based on towns based on like parcel count, location, all those things. Like how could we realistically as a state get on a 6-year cycle, and what does that look like sort of statewide? So let's see. Another question is whether the study is going to look at a statewide CAMA. Yeah, like I said earlier, there's definitely a component of sort of what are those larger IT systems that we can share or we can recommend. Again, the idea is definitely not to take away any control, but rather to what are some things that we can do to give everybody what they need. And Vermont has sort of gone back and forth on statewide CAMA or not over the years. So we will definitely be addressing that, whether it's statewide CAMA or more likely what I think we all agree would be great and seems to be a lot of interest in from CAMA vendors and from firms and definitely from the legislature is, can we have a set of sort of standardized fields that each of the CAMA vendors provide, whether it's to us or VCGI, to that sort of everybody's field of certain, year built, things like that are sort of standard and easy to collect. So rather than requiring a statewide CAMA, could we say, here's the fields that we need from all CAMAs, and the vendors map their fields to that, and then we're all kind of talking in the same language. Another question is asking about more support in GIS and mapping, which is great. I'm so happy that this question came up, because we do think there is room for more support from the state for the GIS and mapping. There are some statewide mapping and orthophotography opportunities already with VCGI, and we would like to sort of leverage that to give every town and every reappraisal firm those sort of oblique and orthophotography outcomes for Vermont that could be useful for sort of like identifying buildings, identifying parcels, and things like that. So one of our recommendations that we're drawing up with VCGI is definitely about like how, as a state, we can provide more support for towns on the GIS and mapping side. Right now, there was the statewide parcel mapping program that did get an allocation from the legislature in 2019. That was complete. And now it's up to each municipality to sort of provide that data from their mapping vendors. And so that is a cost that the towns have right now. And is there a way we can leverage this report to get funding for that to be sort of a statewide resource going into the future? So it's not dependent on a municipality to decide if they want to invest in that or not. And related to that, as one of the other questions was getting at, is sort of like, are there other ways that we can provide tools on a statewide level, like other methodologies for valuation? So there are things like Eagle View. There's other sort of entities that can do pretty impressive detailed flyover and information, and then they have sketch software that they can use to overlay. And then when they see that there's a discrepancy, or they see that something's there that they weren't expecting, or that is not there that they were expecting, that gives some towns some more information to then do a physical inspection and check out what's going on there. So I would like to sort of use this report to get towns and reappraisal firms more of that technology available to them to use if they would like. All right, well, we see if anyone else has any more questions. Was there anything else, Justin, that we didn't cover? Any other like feedback or thoughts you have about what you've seen in Vermont or heard from Vermont that?
Yeah, I mean, clearly Vermont solicitors and assessors care a lot about making sure values are right and doing a good job. And I hope this isn't, and it shouldn't be seen as an exercise in beating up on what you all do, because it's super important what you do. I know you all work really hard in what you do. I've talked to a lot of people, and there's a lot of good things going on in Vermont too. And hopefully some suggestions for some tweaks here can help you do your job better and move the whole state forward as far as assessments go. And that would be my hope anyway.
Thanks. Yeah, I think overall, right, the guiding principles of sort of why we brought, why we raised to the legislature with many of you, sort of why the reappraisal structure as it is right now needed help is that it really has been really challenging, especially for smaller towns that have not a lot of parcels, to find someone to do the work. There really wasn't any consistency in the like planning ahead of the work, so vendors could not necessarily like staff up or allocate resources very far into the future, because some years there might be a lot under order and some years they might not. We've kind of entered a new era where it would really be great to provide some like consistent planning long term for the towns and the reappraisal firms. Everyone knows the year of their next reappraisal well in advance. Everyone can plan on that and staff up for that. And then also theoretically have some more of these statewide resources available, which would be great. So it's all designed to kind of help shore up, making sure that we can get everyone what they need, because not every town, it's not one size fits all. For some towns, they might think that there's not a problem, and for other towns, they've really struggled to find folks to do their reappraisals, which just sort of continue to exacerbate their problems every year as their CLA and COD gets further and further from being okay. And a lot of the smaller towns also may not have enough parcels in their study or in a reappraisal to really help them come up with some good numbers. So anything we can do to kind of cross-pollinate and help across town boundaries is great. Yeah, there's another question about if there is anything in this report to get more state support for educating appraisers so we can expand our base of certified appraisers and replace those aging and retiring out of the industry. I mean, it's a great point. It's definitely is part of what we were mentioning to the legislature, and also, even what we've found from other states, right? There's not like a degree or a training path into this appraisal industry, and yet there's very much the demand. So we really want to sort of leverage this report to help us get some support for that kind of training and outreach to whether it's technical colleges or the state colleges, right? We have no capacity to sort of do that kind of recruitment right now. We've also been talking to the Secretary of States to see if there's like, if it would be appropriate to have another, licensure path for, municipal appraisal expertise, for example. So we definitely welcome continued ideas on how to, crack that nut, but it is definitely one of the major challenges that we have right now is finding the folks to do this work. And as one of the earlier comments mentioned, also keeping folks doing this work, right? We've had a few instances where someone is, getting the training, they're interested in doing this, they're taking the courses, but if you can't find someone else to work for or work under for a period of time, you can't really grow. And then also, once you're sort of in it, especially at the municipal level, there's not necessarily room for growth because it's dependent on, your town's municipal budget. So it's a really challenging field to get people into and then to get them to stay in there. And so I do think that's part of these recommendations is explaining to lawmakers, like, if we want a good, strong system, we need, we need some skin in the game at the state level. Let's see. Yeah, where are the revenues going to come from to pay for every 6 years? The per parcel payment won't cover it. That will definitely be sort of one of the things we address in the report, is kind of, again, the per parcel payments have not kept up with inflation, and they may not be enough for this level of reappraisal. The idea behind those per parcel payments is that it would cover about a 50% between the state and the town. Like I said, we've actually done an analysis of per parcel payments over the last several years, and there's a lot of per parcel payment money for reappraisals that's gone out that has not been spent yet on a reappraisal for various reasons. So we've got to make sure that we use those funds for what they are. And then, yes, we definitely need to sort of articulate what a new per parcel payment looks like for a 6-year cycle. And we will definitely be strongly advocating for the legislature to hear from you folks. We also welcome comments outside of, obviously outside of this webinar. Please email me or any of your, email Christy, Justin, any of us on this call, if things come up later on that you want to make sure that we capture or look into. Let's see. Another question is, do other states have harder statutes in regards to owner cooperation during a revaluation? Like, if a legal implication, if owners don't answer data mailers, don't allow inspections, don't return income and expense forms, or don't follow the permitting process?
I do know of some states that the burden of proof will shift potentially if they don't provide certain information. Clearly, and I'm sure this is true in Vermont too, if people aren't providing information, it kind of seems like they're hiding the ball a little bit, and boards and courts aren't real receptive to that generally. But in some states, the burden of proof actually shifts from potentially the local municipality to that property owner in certain cases, just depending on the state. But that's all I know as far as legal requirements. I can't think of any other things.
Yeah, and as sort of as far as the repercussions of that, right? Then their valuation is going to be made based on the information that the person can get, and therefore then the person can appeal. But if they don't provide information and don't cooperate, then their assessment's going to be based on not the whole picture, for better or worse. Yeah, another question is asking about outreach to VCGI on potential advancements in LiDAR imagery. Absolutely. We actually meet with them every other week now on this report, because there was just so much overlap between the parcel program, the mapping program, and knowing that they actually have an existing statewide LiDAR imagery. The resolution of the past several years may not be to the level that it would be and can be now, like what we're seeing in other states for use for assessment purposes. But they are actually, it's a 5-year contract RFP, and they are actually going back out. And so they are going to go for a more, a lower resolution. In other words, that the pictures will be more crisp, so that it actually could be something that would be useful to all of you for identifying a little bit more than even what we can identify now. Yep, and then another comment just about having a shared assessor's job to make full-time opportunities for the younger generation, right? We've got some folks that are sort of piecing together full-time roles based on part-time service at different towns, because not every town needs a full-time professional assessor. But cobbled together or pieced together in a partnership, it can actually become a full-time position. Right. All right. Well, like I said, please do. I have no doubt that your juices will continue to flow. This is not the last time we'll be talking to you all about this report. I will connect with VALA folks to make sure I'm available if needed at the next few VALA meetings between now and December. I'm also happy to talk with smaller groups. I'm also happy to receive any written feedback anyone has about this. And then obviously, when we do publish the report, we will be sharing it with all of you, and then it really gets sort of handed to the legislature to determine who they want to hear from, what direction they want to go, if any. And that will be when it's really important that you talk to your lawmakers and that you participate in the process to make sure that they hear from folks whose boots are on the ground. Let's see. It looks like someone's just clarifying Vermont does have statutes on inventory returns with fines and waiving the appeal rights. So it's usually referencing business personal property, but income and expenses are included in the definition of inventories. All right, that's good to know. That makes sense. You can't appeal if you haven't participated in the process. Okay, so we did record this. We are going to post this, and I think I think you've sent me the presentation, Justin. I can make it into a PDF to put up there so folks can take a look at it. A lot of good information in there. And like I said, when we publish our full report, this will be a piece of that larger report as well. Yeah, just thank you everyone so much for coming on. Looks like we have 63 people, which is great. I wasn't sure. I know we're all really busy and it's the middle of the day on a Tuesday. So thank you for coming. And thank you, Justin, for walking us through that and for all that outreach that you folks did. I know you did a lot of work hounding folks to get responses from different states and from Vermont, which we really appreciate it. So thanks everybody so much for being on here, and have a great rest of the week.